I am unbelievably excited for Control Resonant. Remedy makes some of my favorite games of all time. I love the Alan Wake games. I love the first Control. Control, I think, certainly had more interesting like action gameplay from that standpoint, and all of their games go into my personal preference. If I grew up watching shows like The X-Files, I love Twin Peaks, Twilight Zone, so really like to get that style of atmosphere and in-game format. So I love these things. Also, from a tech standpoint, games like Alan Wake 2 and Control in its time really did push a lot of graphical boundaries in what they're able to do there. Now, sometimes that means they can be demanding on the PC hardware. The gameplay trailer that's been released so far that you're seeing behind me right now, I believe was captured on PlayStation 5 Pro, so we're not necessarily seeing what the highest end PC experience could be. And of course, the game is still in development, but coming out in September. Now, today we got the PC system requirements in this post. Now, they are promising more details, because my first thought is that's not a ton of details, but they said that they will be revealing further info on the PC specs ahead of launch with a more detailed breakdown of performance targets before it releases on September 24th. And that's good news. Now, the recommended GPU is an RTX 3070 or an RX 6700 XT. And so the 3070 is only an 8GB GPU, so that does seem to indicate that at least whatever graphic settings their recommended specs are targeting should work on an 8GB card. And also, I mean, this was a mid-range GPU from quite a few years ago. This launched right as I started my channel back in 2020. And so that was quite a while ago at this point. But, you know, the 3070, if you look at how it stacks up to modern cards, it's like, you know, in line with like a 4060 Ti, a 2080 Ti, a 9060 XT, 8GB. Even cards like a 5060 Ti are only a little bit faster. So that's the kind of current gen card we'd be looking at. Now, they also mentioned AMD's 6700 XT, which was generally a little less performant than the 3070, although it did come with 12GB of VRAM, and it was in a similar ballpark. Now, you can't really buy 3070s these days. If you check out Jawa.gg, which is a great used market, it looks like I could find them individually for about $240 or so and up at this point. And for the 6700 XT, I'm finding entire pre-built systems at Jawa here that this system would actually, I think, meet the recommended specs for this game for under $700. And a huge thank you to Jawa for sponsoring this part of today's video. And I can get you $10 off your first purchase if you use code OWEN10 when you follow the link in the video description and or pinned comment. So you could basically meet the recommended specs for this game with this PC. The Ryzen 5 5500 is pretty close to what we're seeing as the recommended CPU, which was a Ryzen 7 3700X. While the 5500 is from a newer generation, it's cut back in some ways to where overall gaming performance-wise would be fairly in line with that. And this PC is also coming with the 16GB of VRAM and a 500GB SSD, which would fit the game. So that's a good way in there. Now at Jawa, you can also find in all sorts of individual parts. You can find the exact custom PC you're looking for, sorting for performance in specific games at specific prices, specific monitor resolutions. And honestly, to fund your upgrade, you can also sell your hardware to fund that upgrade. You can do that at Jawa by creating your own listings, setting your own prices, but you can also take the maximum convenience route and click the Get an Instant Offer button to sell your GPU or CPU to Jawa for an instant offer. Super convenient going that route. Either way, there's tons of great user reviews. And again, you can check the sponsored link in the video description and or pinned comment. Now, overall, thoughts here again, there's certainly going to be more information that we can get out of their later system requirement chart that they're promising to give. But what additional insights can we get out of this one? So again, the recommended spec is a 3070 or 6700 XT. Again, they make sense to pair up against each other in roughly the same sort of ballpark, but do notice that they're not saying what performance target to expect from this. Now, my personal thought here is it's probably 1080p 60 FPS at probably whatever settings would be equivalent to like the PlayStation 5's performance mode. Most console games these days have a quality setting that gets 30 FPS or a performance setting that gets 60 FPS, and usually relies on a lot of resolution scaling and certain things being turned down. The 6700 XT and the 3070 are a bit more powerful than the GPU in a base PlayStation 5, although a bit less powerful than what you get in the PS5 Pro. And so with that in mind, I would, again, expect these to be able to deliver whatever a PS5 is doing in its performance mode at a bit of a higher resolution, and in the case of something like a 3070 with like DLSS upscaling. And hey, actually, even AMD 6700 XT might eventually be getting some version of FSR 4, although the 6000 series hasn't been promised to get that until next year, so not in time for the game's release. So that's kind of what I would expect here. Recommended is probably 1080p 60 FPS at some kind of medium-ish PS5 equivalent settings, but again, that is speculation. My guess is also that it could be relying on like quality level upscaling even for a 1080p output, and if you were on a 1440p monitor, you could probably still get that 60F experience, but maybe rely on more aggressive upscaling, maybe balanced upscaling, hopefully not down to performance mode, but you never know. Again, Alan Wake 2 was pretty heavy. Now, if we go down to the minimum graphics settings, the minimum requirements for the game, they're listing a GTX 1070 or Radeon RX 5600 XT. One thing we can do is look at how that performance lines up with our recommended GPUs, and also if you're screaming at the screen like, I don't have any of these GPUs, what does that mean? Well, again, that's where this relative performance chart is useful. I get this at Tech Power Up, and I'll link it in the video description. So if we keep this 3070 as the baseline, again, you could look at what other GPUs were similar to that. I already mentioned some. But you could also then look at these less powerful GPUs, and if you maybe you have one of these, maybe you have an RTX 4060, that's reaching about 79% of the performance of the 3070. Now I'm going to keep scrolling down, and you can look at the percent of that performance that you're getting. That's of that recommended target where I was speculating on what kind of FPS and settings you might be using. Now as we scroll down, we're going to try to find the GPUs they listed for the minimum spec. So all the way down to, I think it was a 1070 or 5600 XT. So notice that that's about half the performance of the recommended GPU for the game. Let me double check I got those right. Yes, okay, so about half the performance. So that means I would guess that the minimum spec is probably targeting 30 frames per second, either at 1080p native or perhaps relying on some upscaling to get there as well. So I would guess it's a 1080p output at 30 FPS, probably at the lowest graphics settings, and potentially relying on like a bit of upscaling to hit that as well. That's what I would guess based on what we're seeing here, and it does line up with if the recommended spec is getting you around 60 FPS, and this is about half of that, we would be expecting around 30 FPS. Also, the GTX 1070 and the 5600 XT are a reasonable pairing. Sometimes in system requirements charts, we see things paired up that just don't make any sense. So I do like that it looks like the pairings of AMD versus NVIDIA GPUs that they've got listed here do seem to make sense. Now, CPU being listed as an Intel i5 8500 or AMD equivalent. I find it interesting that for the minimum spec, they have a minimum Intel CPU and then or AMD equivalent, and then for the recommended, they do a AMD CPU and then or an Intel equivalent. So just kind of interesting that they chose to go about it that way. So these kinds of CPUs, again, fairly old at this point. I think a lot of people who have at least this class of GPU may have a CPU in line with these. And at least in AMD's case, if you're on a socket AM4 motherboard that would support a Ryzen 7 3700X, honestly, while GPU prices have kind of gone insane, and RAM prices have gone insane, and storage prices have gone insane, not that hard to get like a Ryzen 5 5600 or something like that you could slot into an AM4 platform and have a pretty reasonable gaming performance, faster gaming CPU than what you'd see in like a PS5 console, things like that. System RAM, I'm glad that even their recommended is only requiring 16 with how expensive RAM is these days. So for people building a more budget system, 16 could be okay. Now, 100 gigabytes of SSD space, and they are mentioning SSD. Usually if games say they require an SSD, it's not that you couldn't install them on a hard disk drive, it's just that you may see issues, not just with load times, but sometimes with assets loading in. Sometimes that can cause a little bit of a stutter or hitch, or things being missing as the game kind of can't render them quite on time as it looks for it, in addition to long load times and things like that. So I imagine you could play the game on an HDD if you absolutely had to, but just might not have a great experience. That would be my guess. All right, so really, I wish I had more to say at this point. Like I said, if you have something better than the GPUs listed here, again, maybe you'll spot yours along the way. I would imagine that then you're turning up graphics settings, because I really doubt that that recommended spec was for the maximum graphics preset. In Control games, we've oftentimes seen them push, in the previous Control game was like one of the first big ones with really good ray tracing implementation, where it really helped on a lot of the reflections and things like that. So as you get a more powerful GPU, you could probably enable more of those settings, higher resolutions and frame rates. But again, they did say that we will be getting further details before launch, so stay tuned to the channel. I will absolutely be covering that when we get it. Hopefully you found this video useful and or interesting for now, and don't forget to check out jawa.gg for some great deals on PC hardware, and you can sell your hardware to fund your upgrade. Don't forget that code OWEN10 for $10 off your first purchase. Hope all of you have an excellent day.